Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar with the fabulous Dr. Becky Meyer about how to write an abstract. So this is very, very timely because the final assembly is coming up. And I just wanted to really briefly run through some of those deadlines for turning in materials. So if you are specifically the Boston Final Assembly, which will be on March 12th at the Reagan Institute, if you are going to participate virtually, so through Zoom and Discord in that final assembly, um, you can give a lightning talk. If you are going to be participating in person, so actually coming to the Reagan Institute, if you'd like to give your lightning talk, you'll need to submit an abstract to me this week. It's just a draft of the title and abstract so I can get a sense of what your project is about. And if you could email that to me by Thursday, February 5th, this Thursday, saying that you'd like to give a lightning talk, then we can consider your team. There's a limited number of talks that we can give just due to time constraints with such a large group of teams. And so we are giving preference to the teams who are participating virtually because it is harder for them to interact with attendees through the poster session while they're not actually there in person. So tonight's talk is very important for that. If you are attending in person or virtually, and you want to write an abstract to include in our abstract book, those drafts will be due on February 19th, which is a Thursday, and the finals of those will be due on February 27th, which is the following Friday. So if you are doing the Boston assembly or our Atlanta area assembly, we're going to have one abstract book for that. And then I did send teams an email with some information about the poster deadlines, and I can go over those too, but I will first hand it over to Dr. Becky Meyer here for our How to Write an Abstract.
Right. Thank you very much, Chloe. Hello, everyone. My goal tonight is essentially to walk through a few slides that sort of break down the abstract into all of its component parts so that by the end of the talk, you have a structure where you can pretty much plug in your information into the different sections, and then you have an abstract when you're done. So should hopefully make it a really straightforward process if you want to write one. So the first thing on my slides is to just kind of remind you of like why an abstract is important. It feels like kind of a silly thing to write sometimes after you're spending so much time on the project and you know you're going to talk about the project either in your presentation or if you're writing a paper. You're like, why do I have to like write a summary of this project, before anybody even gets to it? You're probably going to read it anyway. And the truth is that like people actually use the abstract to figure out if they want to engage with you at all. This happens at conferences. People, read through your abstract book, they read the title of your project, they read the abstract, and they decide if they're coming to your poster, often based on that. For papers, that's how we decide which papers we want to read. We figure out what's most interesting to us just based on this abstract. So the abstract is pretty much your kind of one shot at getting people's interests and getting them excited about your work. And different people read the abstract for different reasons, which can be kind of interesting. So if people are new to the field, they read your abstract to try to learn a little bit more about something that might interest them. So they read your title, they read kind of your description of your project and see if they want to learn more about what you did. So you have to write for them to make sure you tell them all the information they need. For people who are experts in your field, they also are absolutely going to read your abstract, but they read it completely differently. So they're looking at your abstract and, they have a basis of knowledge. And so when they're looking at your abstract, they're like, oh, how did they approach this problem? Like, I know about the field, I know their area. What choices did they make? And then they're interested in what you did. And so you kind of have to strike a balance between these two different audiences. You need to give enough general information so that people new to the field can understand your problem, but you also need to give enough technical information that is concise enough that people who are experts still get what they need out of your abstract. So it's a kind of a difficult thing to write, even though it's something we rely really heavily on. So the best description for an abstract is that it's pretty much your project in a nutshell. You're going to kind of highlight every aspect of your project in the abstract itself, and then elaborate on all of those pieces when you're doing your actual presentation or your poster or any sort of manuscript. So, what I want to do for kind of the entirety of the talk is go through each of these pieces that I have on the slide. So, for this slide, this is really just kind of a big overview of what the abstract looks like structurally. So, we talk about the narrative structure of an abstract. So, pretty much how you put the information together. And the way to think about a narrative structure of an abstract is to picture it as an hourglass, where it's very, very wide at the top with very broad pieces of information. It sort of narrows down until you get to your specific project or design. And then as you get into your results and conclusions, you start to like widen the scope of the information back out until you get to a broad conclusion at the end. So on the left-hand side of my slide, I have kind of what we call these kind of in a technical writing field. And then on the right-hand side, I have them rewritten as sort of question prompts to help you go through each section and figure out what you want to put in that. So the first one is the impact statement. This is essentially why do we care about your project? You then have an introduction where you tell us what we need to know to understand what's going to happen. You then address a knowledge gap, which is for you what you built for your project. And then if you have results, we talk about those after. Finally, conclusions that you drew. And then at the very end, you talk about the scientific advancement. So I'm going to break those down sort of piece by piece. And then hopefully you'll get your slides at the end so you can just use these as prompts and design your abstract that way. So the first part of this is what we call the impact statement. As you can see kind of where I have my line in the hourglass, this is the most broad statement you're going to make. It's always the first sentence of your abstract. It's also the first sentence of your paper if you end up writing one of those. And the impact statement is meant to hook your audience. So it tells the audience why they should care about your project. You sort of put the problem in scope so that everybody kind of is interested in why you are studying this and also wants you to succeed. Uh, the way to tie this in is you think about like why you did your project and the most sort of broad topic it can be related to. And usually you already have this in mind. So my example here is that cancer X, cancer type X affects millions of people a year, but it is difficult to diagnose before it metastasizes. So this is a super broad statement. So I even made up a type of cancer for it. This breadth is how you'll hook a number of people into your project. So, people already know what cancer is. That's already something we're aware of and afraid of in certain circumstances. Being able to explain that millions of people are affected by this problem adds another level of urgency to why you would want to study it. And then also indicating like why this problem hasn't been solved before is also a really good hook to get people interested. And usually you're working on a project because it hasn't been solved for one reason or another. So making this sort of initial impact statement that is as broad as possible while still being relevant to your project is kind of key to starting the abstract off right. The relevance to your project is also important here. So if you look at my statement about, cancer being, or, this type of cancer affecting millions of people and then being difficult to diagnose, from reading my impact statement, your thought is probably going to be that my build is something about making it easier to diagnose or an early intervention point. The way I've written that impact statement suggests what it is I'm going to talk about in my project, and it will for you too. So whatever you choose for your impact statement, make sure it is relevant to kind of the actual project you're going to describe, not just that you're saying cancer is bad or slippery roads are bad. Like you need something that kind of connects into what you're going to talk about next. So after you kind of hook that initial interest, we then move into sort of this upper part of the funnel for your hourglass. So this is our background section, and you'll have several sentences or lines of background to make sure people understand your project. So kind of the overarching question to think about here is like, what does an audience need to know to understand your project? And this gets divided into a couple of different types of information. So one type is general background, and that would be pretty broad here still in my kind of schematic. So general background comes right after your impact statement, and it really focuses on what do we need to know about the problem you're trying to solve. So if, cancer is a problem, what else do I need to know about cancer type X? If slippery roads are a problem, what do I need to know about those to really understand the problem that I introduced at the beginning? One way people do this is in my sub-bullet here is by explaining like if there's what we know about the problem and also what has been tried before to solve it. Usually that also gives people some helpful context, and it's probably also something you already know based on your designs. Once you've gone through anything we need to know to understand the problem, still at that really broad level, now you start to narrow down and get more and more specific information that's relevant directly to your project. And we call this your specific background. So in the specific background section, again, narrowing down here, it's really focused on what do we need to know to understand how you are solving this problem. So this is where you'll introduce, say you're modifying a gene. Tell me about this gene at the beginning, so I understand, like, when you're proposing your project, what that actually is. Or if you're using a model system, like a type of bacteria or yeast or even a cell-free system, what is it that you're going to use for your synthetic biology project? And sometimes it's helpful to indicate like why that's a model system you want to use. Like what is, this particular combination of gene and model system give us to help us create a project that's going to solve the problem we set up. So you funnel down this information until you get to the most specific part of your background. And this is kind of our center neck here. In the technical writing field, this is called how you address a knowledge gap. So the idea is that despite all the work that's been done in the field, there's still things we don't know. And so science projects are designed to, investigate or solve problems that haven't been solved yet. And so the things that haven't been solved yet are called a knowledge gap. For yours, I think it's really helpful to think about this as what is it that you're building? So what specifically have you designed to solve the problem you set up for me in the beginning? Again, this is the most specific part of what you're going to talk about. It's where you give the specific details that we understand based on your background and like how those tie in to your overall solution to this. And this is where you can spend a little bit of time. So you'll explain what it is that you're actually building, and you'll also tie into like how the thing you're building is starting to address the problem. So for example, again, in my sort of cancer example, so we have cancer type X, hard to diagnose before it metastasizes. So maybe in my background, I, talk about what previous, studies have found that cancer type X is actually largely driven by mutations in protein type X. And these protein type X mutations show up early in like tumor development, but protein type X just doesn't express very strongly until the cancer metastasizes. And that's part of why we don't detect it until it's too late. So if we could develop a way of detecting protein X before it's expressing at this metastasis level, that would really help us diagnose cancer type X earlier. So my way of condensing that into how like my project addresses this knowledge gap is to set up all that background information I've just told you. And then for my knowledge gap, say, to address this, we built a genetic circuit with a luciferase reporter capable of detecting protein X at nanogram concentrations. Because of all the background information I've given you, you understand why that's important, but I've distilled the entire project into one sentence that really gets to the heart of what you've built and why it's going to be helpful for the project and for the problem you've set up. So after this narrowest part, now we start to widen back out. So you've set up your project, you've explained why it's important, you explain like what you're doing to address the project. Now you start to kind of widen everything back out to explain how it is that your project sort of advances science and fits within the field in general. So the first part you do for that is talk about results. And a lot of you may not have results. Totally fine. This happens a lot at conferences, and it absolutely has happened to me going to conferences. So let's talk about what you do when you don't have a lot of data to necessarily report on. So if you do have data, if you've been testing something in the lab, great, write about that in your results. If you don't, or if there's just not a lot of data to report, what is actually the most beneficial to do is actually lean into some of those details of your design. So, like, how is it that your design actually is something you're going to be able to build? So, if your, most narrow part where you address the knowledge gap by saying, okay, I'm going to build a genetic circuit with a luciferase reporter so that I can detect this protein earlier, in this kind of results section, I go into more detail of, to design this circuit, we're going to use this gene, we're using this vector that has this luciferase tag, we're expressing it in this type of bacteria, here is why, here's how all these pieces come together to actually build the thing that I'm proposing to address the problem. So definitely spend time on that. Not everybody has results, and sometimes it's actually more helpful to share your design so that people can give you ideas or suggest things that might be helpful. Honestly, I've gone to, when I was in graduate school, I went to a national conference to present my work, and for these conferences, you have to submit your abstract months in advance because they're huge, right? Thousands of people are presenting. And so I wrote up the project I was going to do, and I'm like, no problem. This is going to be really great. I'm going to have cool results. It was a great idea. So I wrote it all up, left the kind of results vague because I'm like, I'll have something by the time I get there. And the experiments were not working very well. So what I ended up doing was when I got there, like I was able to still lean into the design that I had proposed in the abstract. And then I got feedback on like how I might tinker with things or suggestions for other design elements. But it was able to salvage my presentation because instead of having to say like, oh, these results I promised don't actually exist, I didn't promise them results. I promised them a design. And so people were able to give me a lot of feedback on that. And it was super helpful and really kind of helpful for me to learn how to talk about design and everybody in the audience. So don't worry if you don't have results. Designs are great and people actually like talking about them a lot. So, okay, so you're widening out at this stage where you've got or design or some results. So you're starting to give some more details. And this is sort of the end of kind of the new information that you're going to present. So then kind of final half of your abstract, which may end up being like a final third because they tend to be a little top heavy, is really about conclusions that you can draw and like how this all fits into a wider context. So we're going to start widening out and making our statements a little bit more broad. So the next section is talking about your conclusions. So this is the same problem again. So if you have data, you can have conclusions from that data. If you write a manuscript, you have a lot of data. So you pick the kind of key conclusions you want to convey. In a design process, you don't have conclusions. You haven't tested it. How can you conclude something yet? Totally fine. Instead, what you're going to do is focus on this transition of like, here is our design, here's the details of our design. This is how it's going to address our problem. So if you have data to plug in later that supports how this addresses your problem, but in the design phase, you really just articulate specifically like how this is going to help you. So for example, if you were using my example of that uh, luciferase circuit that can detect protein X really, really early, I'll talk about like how luciferase is helpful, why we chose luciferase, how that's a better readout than some other options, how this is going to be a useful thing. We can also talk about why the design of the circuit is going to be really helpful. Maybe it allows us to design a small circuit so it's easier to use. You can talk about advantages and like how this is a good idea, and also like limitations that you might want to address or that you just can't get around, but you know are there to kind of help fully flesh out your idea and explain why it's good. Honestly, you spend less time on this than you do on the introduction part, because most people are reading your abstract to understand kind of like how you built your project, what your actual build is, And then the conclusions are kind of much less intense because you can talk about those in person. So even though I have my kind of hourglass shape as like even on both sides, really it's going to be much more top heavy and then a pretty small sort of bottom chunk that we're talking about here. And then finally, after you talk about like conclusions or your design, you're at the final sentence. And this one is super important. It's the one you're going to end on. It's the lasting impression that your audience is going to have of your project. So you want to make sure that it uh, makes sense, that it's, put your project into context, but that it doesn't overstate how important your project is. So the final sentence is intended to kind of explain what your actual project is going to contribute to science. Like, what advancement are we going to get out of your project? It's important to note that like nobody is suggesting your project cures cancer or is a one-stop shop for a diagnosis for cancer X in my circumstance. But the idea is that you're showing how you've made progress towards solving what is a large problem that you've tackled. And as part of that, so this final sentence, again, the most broad, to really put your project into this wide context. It's also important, and that's my center bullet point here, is that your final sentence should somehow relate back to your impact statement. So if your impact statement started with, cancer X is difficult to diagnose before it metastasizes, your final sentence should be, something along the lines of, by, designing and refining this circuitry, we're hoping to identify uh, the driving protein for cancer type X before it metastasizes, and thus enabling us to creates a better diagnostic. You'll clean it up, you make it more concise, but you're tying these two ideas together and showing that your project is the bridge between those two ideas. So you really put your project in context of the field. You set up an important problem. You talked about how you would go about solving a part of that problem, and then you reiterated how your project actually advances things for this particular problem you set up at the very end. So this is really where you give your final context. So this is kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about before we go into sort of any questions. So I've walked through every piece for it, or for the abstract itself, and I can also go back to the first slide that shows them all together. But the last thing I wanted to say before kind of going back to that original visual is just thinking about like other sort of tips for writing an abstract because they, again, are so important and surprisingly difficult to do because you're taking months of work and just condensing it into a very small space. So one thing to note is that abstracts almost always have very strict word limits. I totally forgot to look up what it is for BioBuilder, but I'm sure Chloe has an idea.
I
Yes.
think ours is 150 to 200
Perfect.
as our.
So yes, perfect, right within the range. So the strict word limits are because abstracts are often printed in a book, so you have to fit in a specific space. So if you go over the word count, you often just get cut off. Because you're within, 150 to 200 words, uh, every word pretty much has to count. So what is helpful to do and why like my slides are laid out this way is that it's really helpful for you to outline what it is you want to say in the abstract, and then sort of fill in the spots after that. So this helps make sure that you don't run out of space because you're talking about too much background, or that you don't say something really important because you've just, you went into too much detail about your design. So lay it all out, make sure you know what key points you want to hit, sort of using that hourglass framework, and then start filling in all those pieces. And then after you've done that, it's editing. So much editing. You'll read over it a lot of times. You'll kind of swap out words just to make sure you're within that limit. So the reason I tell you this is never start the abstract the day it's due. So if it's due Thursday, start tonight, start tomorrow. If you start Thursday morning, you are going to regret it so hard. Um, and then the kind of other piece, and this one is important, but again, sometimes not always intuitive. It's that the abstract itself actually does tell a story. So, I've been listing it out as these series of questions and series of facts that you're going to tell us. But a good abstract actually is more than just a list of facts. That's where you start, but you should absolutely be thinking about like how you link information together. So, thinking about this background information after you give your impact statement, the next sentence that you use for your general background should be a way of tying into that impact statement. So kind of leave a trail of breadcrumbs tying every sentence together so that people can follow the story you're telling us. That makes abstracts so much more readable. And one of the ways I found is the best way to do that is actually after you write your abstract, give it to somebody who doesn't know what your project's about. If you've got multiple BioBuilder teams, share amongst each other, bribe your friends, have them read it, have somebody read it who hasn't ever heard of your project, and have them tell you what didn't make sense. It's the best way to figure out kind of like what was obvious to you, but what you didn't connect together for other people. So those are very much kind of my tips for it. As promised, I'm actually going to go back to where I have this whole structure, and then I will stop talking so that folks can ask any questions they have. Or if you are struggling with how to write a section, we can also talk about that too. I'm very happy to talk about anything you're interested in.
Just wanted to reiterate that I really appreciated how you said, you didn't promise results, you promised a design. I'm starting to hear from some teams that they're not sure if they should participate or not because they don't have any results. And so
Yeah.
I just want to stress that presenting a design, is amazing. And it's just a really great opportunity to practice writing abstracts and giving presentations and poster sessions and to be able to get that feedback. So that's a really valuable experience.
Yeah. I feel like Chloe probably also has the same experience, but I can 100% promise you that like national conferences are filled with designs. Like so many experiments didn't quite work the way you thought, but the idea is still really good. And so you want to talk about the idea. So it's not just that like you missed the mark for this conference, like PhD scientists are always presenting their designs.
I'm sure some of the teams must have some questions about their apps, even if it's, kind of individual questions about
Mhm.
how to kind of map your particular project to this structure.
You're also welcome to pop them in the chat if like I hate speaking out loud in front of people. I did also include my email address at the beginning if you want to email questions later. Like there's no like huge time frame to worry about. I guess I'll ask a question for everybody, and maybe that'll start off. So on the slide, I have like all of these different question prompts. Do they make sense? Do you think there's anything I'm missing that you thought you wanted to talk about? Is there kind of anything where you're like, oh, I don't see why we have to talk about this part of it, or I really wanted to explain this and I don't think I can now? Is there anything like that based on the questions I've asked you? Oh, yes. You say, what does this mean for science? It is the human practices.
So I think
Um,
that's a reference to iGEM.
mm,
So
so,
I think, and you can correct me, Nash, if I'm wrong, but I think that's a reference to the human practices requirement of iGEM
oh,
teams. And so that's a little bit different here than what Becky was talking about. So just for context, everyone, the human practices has to do with like iGEM teams kind of like doing, education, outreach and ethics and responsibility and that kind of thing. But I think what Becky's getting at here is a little bit different, so I'll let her.
yes. Oh, thank you so much. Yes, that makes sense now. Yeah, absolutely. I am getting at something a little bit different. You can repurpose some of what you already have written for this, but the idea with this, like, what does this mean for science, is essentially how does your project move the field forward? So it's kind of a way of saying, like, by completing this project, here's what we're going to learn. And so that's really just to kind of put that in context for everybody. We use it as a way of indicating, like, if you funded my project, like what will you get for that? Or just to give an idea of like how it is that you're actually making a contribution that other people can build on. So it's another way of explaining that what you're doing is new and interesting and something that nobody has done before and is important work.
Teams just recently completed their project design check-in.
Got it.
One of those questions on there has to deal with like if your project is successful, like what impact would it have?
Yes, this makes sense. This is also like a great way of doing that. So, I have that for like that kind of bridges the gap between the conclusions parts as well as the scientific advancement. So, yeah, a way of saying like, okay, like if the thing that we designed works, this is what it's actually going to contribute and what other people can build on. That's a great place to put that. And kind of like a really nice ending. It's a good hopeful ending to like get people engaged in talking about your science.
I know some teams, oh, sorry, go ahead, Becky.
Oh no, I was gonna say, the thing I always struggle with is like what kind of background to include. Is that something anybody else is struggling with of like what's important enough to say versus what is like niche information? Does anybody want to talk about that?
It's always a tricky line.
Yes. Maybe not. All right, Chloe, what was your thought?
Um, I was going to say that I know that some teams, are still working on their designs and everything. And so, what I'm looking for on Thursday for teams who are submitting an abstract draft to be considered to give a lightning talk in person is just you're definitely some editing of your abstract before you just turn it in, but it doesn't have to be the final draft. And like Becky was saying, you definitely have time. You should have, if you have other BioBuilder Club teams at your school, or you can jump on Discord and find another team to trade abstracts with, and that the drafts for everyone will be due on the 19th, and then you still have an extra week if you need to make changes to that. And also, sometimes this doesn't happen every year. So I strongly encourage you guys to make sure that you give a copy of your draft to your mentor with time for them to suggest edits and ask questions and kind of clarify things, because your mentors obviously have a lot of experience with writing abstracts and also know your particular project. So it's good to share with them and with people who have no idea what you've done.
Awesome.
I will share these slides along with the recording so you guys can kind of reference this and use it as a template as you write your own abstracts. Oh, Becky, any advice for writing titles?
Ooh, yes. Titles are also surprisingly difficult, but like really satisfying when they're done. Really quick, my favorite story. I was working on a paper, and we finally got to the title section, and we wrote that title 31 times before everybody could agree it was a good title. So titles are kind of a more intense like style of abstract. So you need to convey a key part of your project, but do so really concisely. So one thing to think about with a title is you want it to be specific enough that it helps people understand like what's a key element of your project. So if we're using my cancer example, my title for that project might be development of a biological circuit to improve cancer X diagnostic or early cancer X diagnostic, something that kind of indicates like what my big advancement is from my design. Um, so you want to keep it short enough that like it conveys what it was that you wanted people to know about your project, but also don't put in details that might not mean anything to anybody. So like my luciferase cassette or the type of bacteria, people aren't going to be super interested in that unless that's like a key part of like why you've designed it that way. So I would say focus on the title is like what key thing do you want to accomplish with this project? And then make that like 7 words. So that does a lot of like writing. We tend to write our titles on sticky notes and then mix and match and rearrange like all the keywords we think are important.
So what was the winning title after 31 revisions?
Oh man, I don't even remember. It got down to we started swapping out one word at a time and then would
Oh man.
go back and try again. It took all afternoon. We all really disliked each other at the end of it, but the title was fantastic. I think we also had a really heavy constraint because it was for a journal that will absolutely chop off the title if you go too far. And so we had, I think, like 10 words to work with. So they were the most precious 10 words like that we had ever had in our lives.
Titles are important.
Yes.
We will be excited to see all of your titles. All right. Well, if nobody has, do titles and sources need to be submitted along with our drafts? Are you asking about Thursday? So, you do need a draft of your title and your abstract. And then in terms of your references, that will go on the poster. And also I'm sending out an email. The poster space is quite limited. So I do suggest that teams format all of their references as like a Google Doc and then use a QR code to link that. And since it's a draft due on Thursday, if you want to change your things, you can definitely change. Okay, well, I think that might be all the questions that we have. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful talk, Becky. I love the visual. And yeah, if you have any questions, reach out to any of us. We are happy to help. Thanks, everyone.